Kristen Atchison here, and we're on our second lecture for Perceiving Speech and Music in Chapter 11. So this is our second lecture, Perceiving Speech. So we talked about those phonemes already. How we start to perceive those phonemes is in the categorical perception of phonemes. So how do we say that this is one phoneme versus another? How do we distinguish this? Especially when we have the issue of co-articulation. So we have this idea that these aren't discrete. We're already starting to pronounce the next phoneme before we finish the first. So how do we break up and say this is this phoneme and this is that phoneme? And so that's what categorical perception is talking about. It's the perception of these different stimuli as identical, but up until a point. And it's a very sharp line, okay? It's not, a lot of things we talk about are gradients. This is not one of them. This is going to be a very strict cutoff between the two. And once we get to that cutoff, there's going to be a change in perception. So again, this is not a gradual perception change. This is going to be an abrupt perception change. The difference between da and ta is going to be an abrupt change. And we'll talk about how we do that. And these category boundaries really reflect general auditory sensitivities, but also employ things like memory and other processes. So these are both going to function bottom up, like those auditory sensitivities, such as voicing, but it's also going to be affected top down based on memory and other processes. We'll see that vision will play a role in this as well. And infants are able to do this. Remember I said already at birth, infants are able to discriminate the phonemes in every language. Here is a video I'm going to show you in just a second that kind of shows you kind of how that they can do this both within a language they're familiar with and a language that they're not.
Mother's lap. A researcher sits opposite and keeps his attention on a colorful toy while a tape plays two sounds. One is ba, and the other is da, a sound only used in Hindi and one which most English-speaking listeners can't distinguish from the English sound da. During the initial training period, a toy bunny is lit up in a large glass box to the side of Matthew the instant the da sound is played. When the ba sound is played, the bunny stops, and Matthew turns back to the researcher. The routine continues until Matthew learns to associate the change from ba to da with the bunny. Matthew even turns his head in anticipation when the researchers delay the bunny's appearance. Matthew is now ready for the test phase of the experiment. A new tape is played, this time with two different da sounds that are only used in Hindi. Even though they are two completely different sounds, an adult who can't speak Hindi doesn't hear the difference. But Matthew immediately turns his head towards the bunny when he hears the change from one Hindi da to the other. Although he has never heard Hindi spoken, researchers recognize that at 6 months, he is still the universal listener, able to distinguish all sounds.
So unless you're familiar with Hindi, you probably couldn't tell the difference between those phonemes either, whereas he could. And he was able to see this categorical perception of those, that they were different phonemes. Where our knowledge and our experiences as someone who has not been exposed to Hindi, me in particular, during infancy, I will not be able to perceive that categorical distinction. One of the ways that we make this categorical distinction between phonemes is voice onset time. So voice onset time is the production of the stop consonants and the interval between kind of when we start talking and when we finish saying that consonant. And I'll show you what that looks like in terms of an actual speech signal. And so the idea of this categorical perception really got its start in auditory perception. So this is something that categorical perception is something that is talked about in a lot of different areas, but it really was coming out of auditory perception. So this is where it got its root, was in perception. So here's a quick video that I want to show you that really does a great job of explaining how this voice onset time plays a role in the determining which phoneme is which phoneme falls into which category, this categorical perception. And it really shows you how kind of marked the line is. And what's really interesting to hear is you can hear it for yourself. You can hear it happening. Okay, so here we go.
Categorical perception is the experience of perceiving phenomena that can be varied along a continuum as fixed tokens. Since the speech signal presents us with far more information than we need in order to recognize what is being said, the central idea is that the speech perception mechanism is especially sensitive to specific cues in the speech signal. These cues are not perceived along a continuum, but as fixed categories. Let us take voice onset time to illustrate this phenomenon. The voice onset time, or short VOT, is the point when vocal fold vibration starts relative to the release of a closure. It is crucial for us to discriminate between clusters such as ba and pa, where we know that a gradual delay of VOT does not lead to a differentiation between voiceless and voiced consonants. Let us illustrate this.
Ba, 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 pa, 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 pa.
As we heard, a VOT value of around 30 milliseconds serves as the key factor. In other words, if VOT is longer than 30 milliseconds, we hear ba. If VOT is shorter, the perceptual result is pa. Other perceptual categories relate to the origin of the second formant, that allow us to distinguish between different places of articulation, or frequency patterns that help us to identify a larger number of speech sounds. Categorical perception is thus opposed to continuous perception, where sensory phenomena are not based on fixed tokens, but can be located on a smooth continuum.
So hopefully you were able to kind of perceive that for yourself. It sounded like ba, and then all of a sudden it sounded like pa. So what they did is they took a computer and they were able to manipulate that speech sound. So it's synthetic. And they were able to manipulate the voice onset time to the point that there was a category switch. Okay, so they changed the voice onset time and you perceive the bas, and then all of a sudden you perceive the pas. So again, this voice onset time, and that voice onset time means that thing that they were adjusting in the beginning was the cutoff between ba and pa for that example. So to talk about that further, we see for the difference between the ta and the da, we're going to see a longer voice onset time of 74 milliseconds, being really indicative of its ta, whereas a shorter one of 5 seconds really being indicative of a da. The ta is voiceless, or the da is voiced. Okay, so again, these waveforms, that's what these are, really illustrate what's happening acoustically. You can look at them and see that the beginning looks different. That is that voice onset time at the beginning. The part at the end that really looks similar is the ah part in the da versus the ta. So it's really this difference between the voiced T and the voiceless T and the voiced D that really differ. And again, we're going to see that categorical cutoff there between the T and the D, just as we did in the video between the ba and the pa. We really see that this pair of relatively long VOTs, relatively long voice onset times for the voiceless. So we're going to see that ba is going to be voiceless that we saw in the video, where relatively short VOTs, such as this 5 milliseconds, for the da or the pa that we saw. So voiced are going to be these shorter VOTs, and voiceless are going to be these longer VOTs. This cutoff between the ta and the da is what's called a phonemic boundary. So when we were there at that 30 milliseconds between the ba and the pa, which is what this graph is showing, when we hit that 30 milliseconds, that was our phonemic boundary, okay? That voice onset time of 30 milliseconds really cut off, and you can see that in this graph. You see that people are responding, saying that this is about 100% of the time. As low as it goes is to 90% of the time, or saying, yes, it's a ba. But then once we hit that 30 milliseconds, once we're on the other side of that 30 milliseconds, we're going to say that it's a pa. And again, we go to 90% of the responses saying it's a pa, and then 100 once we get to 40 milliseconds. So this is a really sharp cutoff. Again, this is not a gradient. This is not a gradual thing. We see this really big boundary between them in terms of voice onset time between, again, this example is the ba and the pa that we saw in the video. Now, voice onset time is not the only thing that can discriminate, that can allow us to kind of have these categorical perceptions. The video talked about frequencies, the video talked about formants. Another one of these is vision. And we can do, this is really best demonstrated in the McGurk effect. This is when really vision can capture that auditory information. And when there's that conflict between it, just like we saw with that ventriloquism effect, we're going to see that vision is going to take hold of the situation. So what the McGurk effect does is it pairs one auditory component with a visual component. And both of these are going to be different sounds. So the lips are going to be saying one thing and the auditory is going to be saying something else. And what we'll see is this will really influence that perception of the sound. And if the discrepancy is large enough, the person might actually get a third perception. So they won't perceive it as what the vision says. They won't perceive it as what the auditory says. They're going to see it as something in the middle. So we'll see that this visual information really can change this auditory perception. So here's an example of the McGurk effect.
Watch this experiment. It's called the McGurk effect.
Ba, 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 ba.
What do you think he's saying? If you think he's saying da, 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 you are in the grand majority. But now, close your eyes and listen instead of watching.
Ba, 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 ba.
The voice is saying ba, ba, ba. Now, let's replay it without the sound. Yes, it's true. His lips are saying ga, ga, ga. So how is it that when the lips are saying ga, 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 and the sound says ba, 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 that our brains read da, da, da? The McGurk effect. It's an example of an auditory illusion. It's a great way to show that the accurate perception of information can involve the participation of more than one sensory system, in this case, vision with sound. We call it multimodal perception. The McGurk effect, it's a terrific example of the fact that the senses did not evolve in isolation from each other, but actually work together to help us perceive our world. When multiple senses are stimulated simultaneously, the brain begins to experience an information-rich learning experience and laps it up like ice cream. It encodes more information per unit time, and it remembers that information better, too.
So you saw, hopefully in the video, if you didn't see it, I encourage you to watch it again and really watch his face. Because if you're not watching his face, when I knew what the McGurk effect was, so when I first was checking out this video, I wasn't watching his face. And so I first perceived it as Bob because I wasn't getting that visual information. But when I went and watched it and really looked at what he was saying, then I got that perception of da. Again, his lips aren't saying da, or his audio is not saying da. He's saying ga. So again, we're getting that third perception of that da between that ba and that ga. So again, this is that idea that this vision is really playing a role, and it's playing a pretty big role. And we know that by 6 months of age, infants are really know that the voice and the face are supposed to go together. And if these things aren't synchronous, if these things aren't synced up, they really have problems processing speech. And this is with very, very young infants. 4-month-olds, they know that they're supposed to go together, but they can still process that speech kind of without it. Without that synchrony. But 6-month-olds really know, by the time they're 6 months, they really understand that, hey, these things are supposed to go together. And if they're not go together, then what's going on? And trying to figure out why those things aren't going together instead of really just paying attention to either the audio information or the visual information. So we also know that, again, knowledge is going to contribute to this. And there's two forms that we're going to talk about. The first is is the probability, kind of our previous experiences of what sounds go together. And this is called a statistical learning. And this is knowing when phonemes go together in your language and when they're not supposed to, kind of the probability this is going to happen. Again, this is going to be experience-based. This is going to be based on the experiences that children and adults have had with their environment. The other kind of knowledge that's going to really affect speech perception is context. Okay, so when you hear something and there is maybe some ambiguity, that context is going to help you figure out what that word was supposed to have been. And so that knowledge of different situations and around the situation will really help in your speech perception as well. So one of the ways that kind of our previous knowledge of the statistics of our language helps is with word segmentation. So word segmentation is the idea that how do you break apart this stream of speech into individual words? We don't stop in between words. We stop at the end of sentences. See, that was really uncomfortable. So much that I did in between is 2 words instead of 1. That's not how we talk, right? If you've ever listened to a language that you're not familiar with, especially one that you've never heard before, it sounds like a never-ending stream of words. You're like, why do they talk so fast? That's because you don't know where the word segmentation breaks are. It's not fast if you know where those word segmentation breaks are. So in reality, we really have this continuous connected stream of sounds, except when we're pausing. And again, that doesn't happen very frequently when we're speaking. This was really investigated. It's been investigated in a number of different ways, but it was first discovered really with work with infants. And your book talks about it as phoneme transition probabilities. The infant literature refers to it as statistical learning. So either one is fine. That's why I have them both there. But the idea is that for a particular sequence of phonemes, what are the chances are that those phonemes go together? Or they're going to happen at the beginning of the words, at the middle of the words, at the end of the words, or if those phonemes don't go together, if those phonemes never are together, then that gives information to the listener that, hey, I bet that's a word break. And so Aslan, Safran, and Newport really in 1998 were really some of the first people to really look at this. And they found that 8-month-olds can really detect these regularities, these probability regularities in a stream of speech. And now what they did was, this is a nonsense stream of speech. Those aren't words. If you look at those aren't words. And so what they would do is they would give infants this 2-minute stream of speech that literally had no pauses in it. And then afterwards, they would test to see if they had noticed these regularities, noticed these phoneme transitions. So they would test them on maybe pabaku versus ku daru, these nonsense words. And what they found was that the children that had listened to the speech stream that had pabaku in it, in the purple you see here, recognized that as a quote-unquote word. They put those phonemes together. Whereas infants that had listened to this stream of speech that maybe didn't have that, didn't necessarily notice those breaks. Statistical learning and these phoneme transition probabilities it's pretty complex stuff. So if you're having problems kind of understanding, and I don't need you to understand the complexities of this for a second, but if you are having problems understanding that kind of it's through experience that we and infants, all language speakers and learners, notice what phonemes go together. And we're not doing this consciously. This is going to be an unconscious process where we're picking up on this kind of the regularities in our speech, the probability regularities in our speech. There's a video that Jenny Safran is in an interview, and she's talking about this study and kind of how this works. And so if you're interested, watch it. It can help you understand this. I've searched for years for an excellent video on statistical learning in terms of speech perception and have yet to find one. So I'll keep looking, but for right now, the best we have is Jenny Safran describing it in her own words, which she was one of the authors, and she continues to do work in this area, so it is very helpful. Okay, the last thing that we want to talk about is perceptual completion. Now, we've already talked about this a little bit when we talked about it in terms of grouping principles in auditory scene analysis. That idea that we can fill in gaps that are kind of occluded through sound. This is that phoneme restoration effect. And again, this is where we're going to fill in those phonemes that aren't there based on our prior knowledge of our language and of the context. So this is where context is going to play a role in some ways as well. So we're going to be able to kind of hear those speech sounds that weren't there. We fill in that missing information automatically. And we're not doing this with conscious awareness. Our brain is doing it automatically. And so it seems like we're hearing those things even when we're not. And this is really coming from that bottom-up kind of processing. This works better when the masking sound and the mask sound are really similar in terms of their frequency. Remember, we had the video example in chapter 10. There was also an example of this in the auditory illusions video that I have linked in this module. And again, you can hear those phonemes that aren't there. And so again, they're replacing those phonemes with something else. The auditory illusions video does a really good job of doing it very, very quickly as well to see this phoneme restoration effect. Okay, so that ends our conversation about perceiving speech. Thanks.